He sat there and said, well, we know what's wrong with your brother. He has something called fatal familial insomnia, and there is no treatment, and there is no cure, and it is genetic, so you need to be tested as soon as possible.
How long you been here? Yeah. How much?
2 weeks.
Okay.
Typically one day in middle age, the sufferer begins to have trouble sleeping. Once the sufferer can no longer sleep, a downward progression ensues as he loses his ability to walk or to balance. Perhaps most tragic, the ability to think remains intact. Only the desperate look in their eyes shows that they know what is going on.
Have you ever wondered what it would be like if you never fell asleep again? What if one day you just simply lost your ability to sleep? What may sound like the plot of some horror novel is in fact a very real and a very frightening and downright cruel condition.
There are numerous conditions, disorders, and illnesses that either limit or prevent the amount of sleep an individual is able to get. Many of them are quite dangerous, but none of them are quite as frightening or as rare as fatal familial insomnia.
As it's summarized on Wikipedia.com, fatal insomnia has no known cure and involves progressively worsening insomnia, which leads to hallucinations, delirium, and confusional states like that of dementia. There's no cure. Treatments are still iffy at best, and as the name of the disorder suggests, the prognosis is always fatal.
You know, there's only one thing worse than not getting enough sleep, and to my mind, that's not getting any sleep at all.
The human brain cannot function without sleep. It's as vital to it as food and drink.
The illness takes on two main forms. First, there's the more common, albeit still incredibly rare variant known as fatal familial insomnia, or FFI for short. FFI, as you may have guessed it, affects members of a family, immediate and extended members alike, due to a genetic mutation. The first person ever documented as falling victim to this genetic form of the illness was a doctor from Venice, Italy. This man spent months upon months in a comatose, sleep-deprived stupor, plagued by delirium, hallucinations, and overall mental agony, until he finally succumbed to his own symptoms and died in 1765. The doctor's nephew was the next one within the family to develop symptoms, and the illness would continue to pass through the generations, through his two sons, their children, and so on. This Venetian doctor had come to be known in medical circles as Patient Zero. As of the year 2016, there were less than 40 families worldwide known to carry the gene linked to the illness.
Are forever trying and failing to fall asleep. Before dying, they hover for months in a twilight world.
You're in this grey area, in this limbo land between being awake and being asleep, because your brain is so exhausted that you get into a perpetual stage of a dream.
The second of the two types, called Sporadic Fatal Insomnia and abbreviated SFI, is even more rare, and as of 2016, there have been only 24 diagnosed documented cases. Sporadic fatal insomnia refers to cases in which an individual, as opposed to an entire family, spontaneously presents with the disorder due to a non-inherited mutation. Fatal insomnia has been known to appear in individuals anywhere from age 13 to 60, although 50 is the approximate average age for the disease to first show symptoms. Once initial symptoms present themselves, a person then can go on to live anywhere from several months to several years, and a few have managed to live longer, although symptoms will always systematically worsen over time.
By now, he'd gone without sleep for more than 130 days. Even the most powerful drugs had little effect. Sometimes Cork appeared to be dozing, but EEG measurements of the electrical activity in his brain showed nothing that could be classified as sleep.
1, you're not sleeping. 2, you're having difficulty walking. 3, your ability to focus has gone downhill rapidly until about ordinarily the 9th month the disease ends with death.
You may be surprised to learn that up until very recently, not a whole lot was known about this illness, and in fact, it wasn't until after the death of a certain patient in 1984 that the disorder even had a name. The patient in question is a man known as Silvano, who was a descendant of patient 0. As legend has it, Silvano, even at the age of 53, was a well-traveled, handsome, and debonair man. And it was one day in the 80s, while he was dancing with his mother on a cruise ship, that he suddenly became aware of the fact that he was sweating rather profusely. From that point forward, it is said, it was just a short matter of time before he would accumulate all of the other first-stage symptoms as well. Pinpoint pupils, restless sleep, etc. But before we take a look at how this one man would come to serve as sort of a cornerstone for research and new discovery with regard to this mystery ancestral illness, let's first stop to peek in at what actually characterizes both familial and sporadic forms of this condition. Fatal insomnia is now commonly categorized by 4 distinct stages, although the progression of the disorder and its symptoms are still subject to vary depending on the individual. Stage 1 is characterized primarily by the onset of the worsening insomnia. Patients may also exhibit anxiety-like symptoms, such as panic attacks, paranoia, and even phobias. In stage 2, the panic attacks become significantly noticeable, and at this point, the victim will often start to hallucinate as well. During stage 3 is when the victim finally loses his or her ability to sleep altogether. Sudden rapid weight loss may be observed in the sufferer as well. Finally, during stage 4, the final stage, at last the victim more or less experiences a loss of all of his or her faculties. Over the course of this final stage, dementia will set in and the patient will become mostly unresponsive or altogether mute.
I took some photos to her to help her realize who I am. I am your sister, I kept saying, but she didn't recognize me. She couldn't speak. She couldn't understand what was happening to her.
As mentioned, of course, the disease only continues to worsen until the patient's body and mind can no longer continue to hold up. Some other symptoms that patients of FFI or SFI experience include but are not limited to neck stiffness, meiosis, profuse sweating, difficulty swallowing, impotence for men or sudden menopause for women, elevated blood pressure, elevated heart rate, feeling either too hot or too cold, constipation, confusion, ataxia, short-term memory loss, obvious cognitive impairment. Strangely, one symptom that comes unique to the sporadic brand of the illness is the development of double vision.
Other symptoms associated with FFI include a lack of controlled movement or coordination, as well as personality changes.
Some patients have presented with symptoms that might seem pretty bizarre, or at the least very unique.
9 months after he caught the cough that wouldn't go away, Rick White died.
She was complaining of giddiness, and she walked unsteadily.
What patients do all seem to have in common, however, as the disease continues its downward decline, the closest a victim can get to actual sleep is, as the BBC puts it, a sort of mindless stupor, during which one is not quite asleep yet not quite aware.
Essentially, they are so sleep-deprived they enter a dreamlike state when awake.
Hypnagogia is the term used to describe that transitional state that occurs right in between being awake and being asleep. As patients with fatal insomnia worsen, they eventually fall into a perpetual state of hypnagogia, a highly disorienting wakeful REM state. And it's said that this is more or less the final state in which they come to remain trapped or stuck.
The first 2 stages are lighter sleep, and then you get into the deeper, more restorative sleep at stages 3 and 4. For the restorative sleep that we think of in terms of healing our bodies and our brains, being able to lay down new memories, remember things for the next day, a lot of that is most impacted by getting enough of that deep sleep, stage 3 and 4 sleep.
As a result of this, of being caught in this waking state of REM sleep, in many fatal insomnia cases, a patient that has succumbed to the later stages of the disease may be observed acting out their daily activities or else acting out their dreams. In this footage, Silvano is seen mimicking the act of combing his hair and buttoning up his shirt. Doctors who had been given the permission to observe Silvano as the illness overtook him had also reported watching him act out very vivid and very elaborate dreams. One of Silvano's distant cousins, Teresa, also fell ill to the disease, and she too would on occasion be found mimicking actions that once were familiar to her. Having been a hairdresser prior to falling ill, she would sometimes be found in a trance-like state, just mindlessly mimicking the actions of combing one's hair.
Teresa might have been the saddest case they ever saw in Bologna. She was just 36 years old with 2 little boys. Out of nowhere, she started bumping into furniture, acting confused, and showing the symptoms of FFI. Poor Teresa, she had these dark circles under her eyes, and she had this 1,000-yard stare. She suffered horribly.
Another famous case study documents the slow decline of one patient commonly referred to by just the initials DF. Proceeding to try every last remedy available to him, from herbal remedies to a sensory deprivation chamber, in the end, DF, like all of the other rest, would too fall victim to this strange disease, all of which he documented in excruciating detail.
Much of the time, DF was confused and sat entranced for hours. On occasion, he would get up for water, forget why he had gotten up, and return to the couch empty-handed. He might repeat this behavior for hours, never actually obtaining the water and not guided by the fact he was thirsty.
Even though as of right now, in the year 2022, both forms of the illness still remain fatal, significant advancement has been made in only recent decades. Remember Silvano, the once suave and charming 53-year-old descendant of patient 0? You see, he knew about the familial illness. When Silvano began developing symptoms of FFI, he was at that time fully aware of his fate, which, if you recall, at that time didn't have a name and was best known as the family curse. Silvano knew it was going to be a coin toss as to whether he ended up having inherited the mutation or not, and his onset of initial symptoms told him that he had. At the renowned University of Bologna in Italy, Dr. Pietro Cortelli, of course, knew not of this mysterious illness, but he would listen intently to Silvano as he traced his lineage back and let Cortelli know that within a few months, he would be dead. At first, Cortelli took Silvano for a pessimist, but upon hearing Silvano's unusual story, the team at the university realized this could be potentially a groundbreaking opportunity for them. Thus, in the clinic, they set up cameras to document Silvano's gradual yet inevitable decline.
Silvano looks as if he's sleepwalking, but that is really because he's in a permanent state of pre-sleep behavior.
Here you can see the famous footage of Silvano only a couple of months before his death. The exhaustion in his eyes is almost unbearable to look at, and one can only imagine what he is feeling and thinking, if anything at all.
This was done 2 months before he died.
His eyes are sort of half open and half closed. The lid's kind of partly down, but what's oddest is that the eyes don't really seem to be focusing anymore.
Perhaps it was that Silvano did not want his early demise to be in vain. Instead, Silvano had presented himself to the research hospital with the very hope that by studying him and the disorder that was eating away at his mind, advances could somehow be made in demystifying the illness that had plagued his ancestors for the last 200 years. True to his word, sadly, Silvano died in July of 1984, but not before donating his brain to science in the hope that something would be uncovered. Probably feeling a mixture of skepticism and apprehension, researchers were in for a wild discovery when they finally were able to conduct a post-mortem examination of Silvano's brain. While most of Silvano's brain seemed relatively intact, it was a very small part of the brain called the thalamus that was very visibly deteriorated. It looked like it had been riddled with tiny holes. But what could have caused this, and what did it mean? To pathologist and professor Dr. Pierluigi Gambini, this sponge-like pattern of holes looked all too familiar, and he claims that in that moment, he was nearly certain of what the cause of this horrid illness was.
I noticed a limited area containing what we call spongiform degeneration, so that in that particular area, the brain looks like a sponge. Spongiform degeneration is the typical lesion of prion diseases.
There's this one protein that's sort of at the heart of this disease, the prion protein. This is a protein that we all have. We're all producing it all the time, and it's part of normal biology, but it's capable of undergoing this, basically a change in shape.
A problem occurs in instances where protein folds abnormally, which begins a domino effect. One misshapen protein attacks a healthy one, converts it, and the cycle continues on and on. When these misshapen proteins, which are called prions, attack the brain, the Swiss cheese-like pattern observed in all prion diseases is what results, also accounting for a barrage of unpleasant symptoms. In the end, FFI, it turned out, was a prion disease. This made it a cousin to other already established prion diseases such as scrapie, mad cow disease, Carew, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD. The difference being that in the case of those with the progressive insomnia, the damage pretty much zeroed in on the thalamus region of the brain. This was important as it offered an explanation for the symptoms these patients were exhibiting, and also for the reason their sleep was being slowly yet surely inhibited.
Prion diseases are a category of rare, fatal brain diseases that can strike both humans and animals. Like all prion diseases, fatal familial insomnia, FFI, is caused by a change or mutation of the PRNP gene, which allows it to clump together in the thalamus region of the brain, eventually destroying the cells there.
Damage to this area destroys the sleep onset mechanisms. It's as though the brain's sleep switch has been jammed in the awake position.
The thalamus region controls sensory and motor skills, as well as regulation of consciousness and sleep.
The thalamus is composed of nuclei. The nuclei impact movement, memory, reasoning, even consciousness. Well, 90% of the neurons in 2 of the nuclei in Silvano's thalamus turned out to be completely destroyed. So we now knew that those 2 specific nuclei were crucial to the sleep-wake cycle. Two years after Silvano's death, the Italian team publishes an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and they finally give the disease a name.
Well, the disease is fatal. The disease is familial, so called fatal familial insomnia.
It is still not known why that particular structure of the brain, i.e. the thalamus, is the one target of these prions, but the ability to now give the illness a name, fatal familial insomnia, and the ability to now classify it as a prion disease has shown promise in paving the road for more discoveries in FFI and SFI research, and hopefully one day to even find a cure.
I think in the last year, in the last 2 years, in the last 3 years, there's been such huge progress and such huge medical advancements that there is optimism now, there is hope for a cure.
Others with FFI and SFI both have followed in Silvano's footsteps and donated valuable brain tissue to researchers aiding in further discoveries and developments or serving to corroborate pre-existing observations and theories. For example, one discovery important to those with the SFI variant form of fatal insomnia is that in SFI and FFI patients, the illness appears to look more or less identical. That is, in both subsets of fatal insomnia, prions attack the thalamus region of the living brain. The only difference being, of course, that in SFI, genetics are not at the root of the mutation which spontaneously occurs. It is therefore logical that any kind of treatment found to benefit either form, sporadic or familial, will also benefit the other.
Proteins are released from brain tissue into the spinal fluid, and so we can get a snapshot of what is happening in the brain.
We're here to be guinea pigs. This is what we signed up for, and it's half an hour of pain for what could potentially be a cure in the future, so it's a no-brainer.
Another aspect that may be of interest is with regard to testing. With the discovery of FFI as a prion disease, as well as with researchers having come to map the gene itself, this has made it so that suspected carriers of the gene can now undergo relatively simple tests via simple non-invasive blood work to determine at any point in that individual's life whether they have inherited the suspected FFI gene or not. The descendants' odds are always 50-50. Further exciting scientific advancements now even allow those with the gene mutation to procreate without passing the mutation along to their offspring.
He was no longer able to carry on a conversation. You got nods, and you got the occasional yes, and the occasional no, and that was it.
The disease robbed her of all control over her body. After 9 months, unable to swallow or speak, she died.
Again, great strides have certainly been made, and yet the fact that both FFI and SFI still remain fatal at the time of this recording means that much more research still is left to be done. Despite the rareness of both fatal familial and fatal sporadic insomnia, whether it runs in your family or not, it is certainly my hope that given the prognosis of this affliction, not to mention the terrible evolution of its symptoms, the public at large will continue to back the raising of awareness and support the quest to uncover a cure.
This was an unusual disease. This was an unusual disease. It's called fatal familial insomnia. Patient zero was a Venetian physician. He was like a very serious Alzheimer's patient. If you Google familial insomnia, you'll see a lot of pictures, a lot of faces, people that have had this problem. It's very interesting to note that you'll see a couple of faces on here, famous people. Thomas Edison and Margaret Thatcher. Did they have familial insomnia? No, they did not. Both of them were quoted as having said that sleep is a waste of time. Obviously didn't know anything about familial insomnia, maybe never really ever thought that much about the death toll on highways. So again, sleep is important. Most of us don't have to worry about familial insomnia, but all of us need to worry about that. Sleep is very important for every one of us.